Okay, hello, good evening. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Welcome to the prestigious Inside Out speaking series, whose mission is to bring the best minds of our generation to inspire and support the work students and staff do across the School of Art, Architecture and Design at Leeds Beckett University. Tonight, we welcome the American artist, Erica Baum, all the way from New York City. I've been practicing her name all day, and I've just messed it up terribly. I'm so sorry. Baum. Okay, Erica Baum. We welcome Erica Baum, all the way from New York City. We must also thank our affiliate partner, the Lawrence Stern Trust. The curator is here, Patrick Wildgust, for making this visit possible by hosting Erica Baum as their artist in residence for 1 week at Shandy Hall, Coxwold, North Yorkshire. I have two of Erica's bookworks in my library, Dog Ear here and The Naked Eye, which I got signed today, okay? Total nerd moment, but there you go. Both works are strikingly simple concepts and utterly brilliant at the same time. As artists, our work is defined by the choices we make. I know some bibliophiles in the audience, probably John McDowell, Chris Taylor, will have a sharp intake of breath and the temptation to say, tut tut. But I must confess that yes, I too have dog-eared many a page, but I didn't have the wit to realize what I was doing could be read as art, or the eye to make the selections that allow Baum's work to resonate so powerfully. Mine has been the mindless marking of my passage through the books I read, or try to read. As the New York poet Kenneth Goldsmith said in his introduction to Erica Baum's Dog Ear, all of Baum's texts hold up to close scrutiny. It's here that the crux of her practice is revealed. She has selected these dog ears equally for their visual and literary merits. Try it yourself. Pick up a book and try to dog ear a random page. Chances are that you won't get a literary resonance the way that Baum does. If she's just fetishizing old books, any page would do. But it's the bouncy resonance of the text combined with the striking beauty of these configurations that gives this body of work the power that it has. This tonight is a real treat to hear Baum speak of her work. Please join me in extending a very warm Yorkshire welcome to Erica Baum.
Well, I have to say thank you, first of all, to Simon Morris for inviting me into Leeds Beckett University, and also to Patrick Wildgust and Shandy Hall for hosting me. It's been a wonderful week, and I'm very happy to be here, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to take you through a journey through a number of series of projects that I've done. I tend to work in series, so when I'm presenting our, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 examples from 7 different series. Somewhat chronologically, it gets a little muddled as far as the chronology towards the end, but I'll explain why. So to begin, what we're looking at here is one of my earliest complete endeavors. I wouldn't say complete as a project, but complete as a concept for myself. When I was studying in college, I majored in anthropology. And when I was in graduate school, I was in graduate school for photography, and I started doing an anthropological look at student life at Yale University, where I was studying. And I started to get mostly interested in the trappings of student life. I'd initially been photographing the students, but I was more interested in the textures of student life. And one day, I took my view cameras to the classroom and I started photographing the blackboards. So you're going to see just 3 examples from this series. And what was really an exciting moment for me there was that it was photographic in the sense that it was capturing something ephemeral, what's left on a blackboard, and arresting it in that moment. But it also had a sort of linguistic properties as well, because I had little traces of language. And to backtrack a little, I studied anthropology and I also studied applied linguistics, and I got very excited in the signifier and the signified, and that fact that the blackboards allowed all those different ideas to kind of coalesce. And what also excited me was the visual field and the visual properties that the large format view camera could draw out. So might glance at a blackboard and see the chalky dust, but the texture that gets enlarged with a large negative that you get with a large format view camera allowed more attention to that. So just to kind of go back to what Simon was saying, I feel like I'm always trying to find things where there's a linguistic property, a language property, but also a visual property. So I got very excited when I first found these blackboards and started photographing them. And I was looking at classrooms in Yale. Most of them were language classrooms, so that was kind of fortunate as well. There was a sort of palimpsest of languages, and you can see a couple of different languages there. And that's just what was left on the board in between classes. Then one day, I was in the library. Went too fast. One day, I was in the classrooms, and I used to go around to all the classrooms. At times, I knew they weren't occupied, especially on the weekends when people weren't there. But one day, all the classrooms were filled, and there were high school students taking tests, and I wasn't able to photograph anywhere, but I had my view camera, and I had my lights, and I was ready to go. So I took it all to the library. And that's where I had another epiphany. I was really excited. I took the same kind of sense of close scrutiny and attention that the view camera brought to the card catalog. And actually, I'm going to go back a second. With all of these projects, it became clear that the things I was looking at, the sort of 20th century material, tactile things I was always looking for, are becoming obsolete or changing. So dry erase boards have replaced, to a large degree, chalkboards. And similarly, not everyone will recognize a card catalog. But at the time when I started this project, this was in 1994, in my mind, this was a quotidian thing that we all used and all did. And the idea was that let's take another look at something that we all do. And that kind of idea has permeated through all my projects. However, there becomes a kind of documentary aspect to it as well, because these things are being replaced by the immaterial. What I was particularly excited by when I started elaborating with this card catalog project, which I began in that serendipitous moment right towards the end of my time in graduate school. I took the project and brought it with me when I came to New York and used a lot of libraries in the New York City vicinity. So each library and access to each library told a different story. I can recognize the libraries just from the kind of qualities. So this library is in Jersey City, and it was a Jersey City public library. And I went in and had a nice talk with the librarian there, and went and photographed several times, and then found that they were taking all the card catalogs and putting them in the basement. That was when I really started to realize that this was changing, and that I was going to be documenting something as well as just commenting on something. What I particularly appreciated in the Jersey City ones was the handwriting and the sort of worn, torn wear and tear, the feel of the hand on this subject heading. And there's also what's always interesting to me with the card catalog pieces are the juxtapositions of language. So just to familiarize you with what you're looking at, you're seeing rows and rows of cards, and these larger texts are the subject headings, and then inside each one is a different page or index card. This is the NYU library. I don't always give away things, but I figure that it doesn't really matter if you know that that's the NYU library. At NYU, I have no relationship to New York University, so I had to write letters to the librarian and be allowed to go for very specific periods of time, write additional letters to the librarian to go for more time. It was very specific. And I always really enjoyed the text in this one, and it feels always relevant. This is probably NYU as well, and I'm not sure if I have one from Columbia, but I'm going to tell the Columbia story as well because it's a fun one. So at Columbia University, I had gone to Barnard College, which is part of Columbia University, and I had an alumni card. I went in, I never spoke to anybody, I never had permission. I brought my view camera, I brought my lights, I plugged in the lights. And they were renovating at the time, and I think they assumed I was part of the renovation because I kind of looked so official. But never did I go there at all with any permission. And recently I visited the rare manuscripts part of the library, and you have to sign in, and you have to promise all these things, and you have to promise you won't use like lights or a camera, and so I laughed that I had actually done all that. This is Jersey City again. I'm not sure if this selection gives you an example of every library, but I think it's interesting. There was another library in Hoboken, New Jersey as well that I went to, got permission from the very kind assistant librarian, and was there and was really enjoying working. And then one day the head librarian came in and I guess minded that the assistant librarian gave me permission and I was kicked out. So access is an interesting thing when you're a photographer. And I always like this sort of undermining of the text. So I'm kind of, this isn't scary. So I like the way in which, you present something and you kind of have the tension of the demonstrated word and then the way it's presented, and to kind of undermine that feeling. And especially the things like something that doesn't exist anymore as well, the idea that the bottom monsters would have to be corrected by hand. Nowadays you never see things like that. I've come to appreciate the fact that these things are obsolete, even though it's not necessarily about obsolescence. So from here, I'm introducing another project. I was told at the time, I would be told about different libraries that were really nice to visit, and someone told me that I should go to the Frick Museum, to their art reference library. And that was really interesting because, again, this becomes a sort of subtext of everything I say. They had a art reference library that included, initially I was looking at their card catalogs, but they also had a photo archive of 8x10 glossy photographs, black and white photographs of paintings, not restricted to the Frick collection, that were meant to be of use for art historians. And I just think it's fascinating because nowadays, of course, if you're curious about something, you just type in 2 letters and you get, you don't even have to know how to spell the artist's name and you can probably get an image about them. But in those days, you might actually really have to go and use a resource like that. The Frick Art Reference Library, again, was a place where you had to have very, very controlled, they're sort of famous for the way that they controlled who could come and go. They had a kind of a the cloakroom where you went and checked in. And anyway, I became really interested in the card catalog index to the photo archive, because what the librarians were doing was cross-referencing the subject matter of all the different photographs of paintings. So there's a lot of this, of this, of this, of this. But what was really interesting to me was that they were kind of found poems that became not just, so in other words, this one on the other side is a specific painting. But on the back are all the different ways in which that painting might be cross-referenced, so that if you're an historian and you're interested in pewter, you're going to possibly find it through a different route. And to me, they were just sort of ripe, all the fruit. They were sort of ripe with all kinds of possibilities. They point in this sort of indirect way to a painting that we can only imagine, a still life. And then they also point to the subjects of art. And it was just very interesting to me to think about the subjects of art, especially when you're thinking of a place like the Frick and they're talking about several hundred years worth of art. So it's gives you this sense of subject of art over time. And then again, also, I just really love I would look for the typos and the different kinds of actual physicality. So I'm always looking for language that has a texture and language that has a presence in a visual field, but then I'm also interested conceptually in the absence. So that's what worked for me in this project. The top here is whiteout, which you would use to correct. And again, for me, what I enjoy in this one is the matter-of-fact check marks and then the darkness of the subject. So it kind of undermines the darkness to see it presented so matter-of-factly. And I did a whole series of nudes. I'm just showing you this one. It'll stand in for all the nudes. Yeah, so I just this project, unlike most of the other ones I'm showing you, has a certain finite quality. Most of the projects I do kind of introduce to me an idea that I could carry on that doesn't really have an ending. So blackboards, I could continue to look for blackboards. The question of whether people are using them is a separate question, but the idea of looking at blackboards could continue. And with the card catalog as well, aside from the question of whether or not they exist, you could continually find examples, and I could continue to do them. And I tend to not really end projects, but just move on and spend my time on a different project. This project is kind of finite in the sense that it was called the Frick. I just call it Frick, and it's specific to this photo archive. I mean, I could potentially do one to another photo archive, but I like the idea that it sort of stands out as a finite project. Then I got very interested in, maybe I should go back to this before I introduce that. So I had been working on the card catalog, and I'd been working with the Frick project. I started looking at books, and I started looking at the indexes at the backs of books. And I was really interested. I was looking, I'm always drawn to old typography and fonts and things like that, and I was really just enjoying looking at some old book. And I really enjoyed the way that the index at that, this was like a turn of the century book, seemed to range at a wide range of subjects, and it just kind of drew me back to this period of time when people would sort of take on not such a narrow specialty, but just kind of employ all kinds of ideas and range around, and so one text might cover a range. And I decided I would look more carefully at the indexes, but I also thought that they were so small that using a view camera wouldn't be the right way to work with it. So this was the first time I did anything that wasn't with a view camera, and what I did was I started Xeroxing lots and lots and lots of indexes from books. I went to a lot from libraries. I went to lots and lots of different libraries, collected lots and lots of indexes, and the kind of quality of the Xerox machine in those days was kind of rough, and there would always be lots of noise that came along with the Xerox. And I ended up making two different piles, a pile of the strip that you see at the bottom, which is really an enlarged weave from a cover of a book, and piles of the indexes. And then I would physically compile them. And so it's a collage in the sense that the words exist as they do in the index, but then I added them to one of the found bits of noise. And then, I'm not sure if you're going to see that in this example, but this was the first time I ever used Photoshop, and one of the things that was funny for me, and this is in 1998, I think, 99, 2000, around then, and I decided, I'm not sure I'm showing you that in this piece, but I decided it would be really interesting to make a blue that was so dark that it appeared black. And the funny thing is that it's because I was new to Photoshop, and also I'm a kind of learn-as-you-go person. I'm not really that techie. I didn't know how to save a color. So when I did this project, if you see them in an exhibition, the blues are different. So it actually, you start to realize that it's a color and it's not black because they actually don't stay stable. Nowadays, if I was to do that and had that in mind, I might have saved the color and made it uniform, and then you really might have just glanced at it and thought it was black. Some of them in reproduction are black, so that's added pleasure. And what was really exciting for me was just, again, this feeling of found poetry, that these things exist, and they're there for us to enjoy if we actually take another look at them. And then I don't title them. Up till now, all these projects are untitled. And the way I'll refer to them is untitled, and then in parentheses, I'll take a bit of text from the piece. This was the last project I made untitled, because I started to realize it was kind of silly, because I was essentially titling them. I was just making it more cumbersome by starting out with untitled. This is interesting. My gallery at the time had this piece up in their office during when the World Trade Center towers came down, and they left it up, and it was kind of interesting because it really felt like that moment. I mean, it was up before that, but it stayed up during that. Then from this project, I'm skipping some, and I'm leaving my chronology a little bit, but I am moving forward. The next project I'm going to introduce is dog ear. And I had this idea, well, let me start. It's easier to not look at it when I begin talking. Someone who ran this was, I guess, in 2008, somebody who had a blog online that they shared. He called it private circulation. Anyway, he knew my work from seeing it elsewhere, and actually from Kenneth Goldsmith has an online platform called UbuWeb, and Kenneth had put a number of projects of mine on UbuWeb. And he had seen the work, and he said to me, could you give me a new language project? And I thought, well, I guess he knows my project, so I can't just give him one of the old projects. I have to come up with something new. And I'd had this idea in the back of my head, and this was the impetus for me to actually execute it and try it. And that's where I started to actually carry out this dog ear idea. And I just had that idea that if, I don't do it with a beautifully made art book, but I'll do it with just a paperback that I'm reading. I save my place by folding it down. And I had this idea that maybe if you fold it and actually look at what the juxtaposition shows you, maybe there's something potentially interesting there. And then I made a few deliberate choices right from the start of kind of uniform fold. At the time, my son was he was like maybe 8 or 10 or something like that, and he was really interested in origami. So I was thinking about the fold and being careful with the fold, and I was also thinking about reading and learning to read and things like that. So I decided to make a very uniform fold. And again, I think that applying a certain uniformity to a project, I think, allows a transparency that it lets you look closer at what you're seeing in the project. I kind of don't want there to be too much interference. So the uniformity for me helps you to see the things I'm really interested in. So in this case, what I'm really interested in is this, again, serendipitous opportunity of found language, and also an experience of the paper and the texture and the font and the different things. And I title them, but I don't title them according to the books I find them in. I'm going to read one aloud, because I sometimes do performances where I read from the dog ear book. So I'll read aloud. One of the things I invite is that you can read it many different ways. And then I realized, well, I do have a way that I read it, so I'm going to read it the way I read it, but that doesn't mean it's the only way to read it. I'm enclosing here or remain. You can also do now this. I'm turned with you if I, answering no, tiniest yes, so it is last, me. Fishes of the fifth, blind fingers in ballets, which all asking to be the water silo of the flesh, in movement braces, we, undines, us, by echoing, pensive. Your sister is not to wear stockings gravely, and the earth was stairs, and I up starry, uninteresting, not even, wheel, king, set. So I'll decide sometimes to make a word or skip a word. And the thing that's interesting for me about reading them is that the way this work comes about is by reading. So in other words, there's a high failure rate. I go through books, I turn the pages, I fold, I take a look, I make lots and lots and lots of copies to look at later, separate from the book. And it's just a matter of putting up with a high failure rate, really. But also it's a matter of reading it, and if I can feel a rhythm to the words and a plausible rhythm to the words. And so I might skip something, but it has to feel to me as though there's some plausibility to the whole. This is the last one from this group. A wave would be heard to enfold the notes, spraying its foam, music. Great, my thing struck in. So I take license. I might add a sound or skip a sound. And then the next project, this is the Naked Eye series, and I started working on the Naked Eye series around the same time I started working on the Dog Ear series. And then I was invited to make a book out of the Dog Ear work, so I left the Naked Eye aside for a while and then came back to it. And I've been actually working on both of them now ever since. And that was in 2009, 2010, around then. And it's kind of good actually for me in a way to leave something aside and then come back to it, because by the time I get back to it, I've been itching to work on it. So in this work, I'll always begin by explaining that I love collage, but what's really important to me about this project is that it's not collage. It's a very simple deadpan photograph of a book. I started looking at old mass market paperbacks, which is, I mean, they probably have them here, but it was a kind of a US phenomenon in the 60s and 70s especially, where they're the kind of paperbacks that they might sell in the supermarket, and they have painted edges. And if you open up the book, you're seeing those edges as lines. And I started looking in particular at books that were, they're called movie tie-ins or fan fiction. Not the kind of thing I would have read particularly, but I was interested in the reproductions of photos and the way in which they were sort of existing in the book, and the way in which simply opening up the book and coming at it from different angles created a different experience of the book. And with each opening, you can get a different picture. And it's kind of endlessly interesting to me, because it really could be such a different experience, and yet it's a very simple deadpan approach. This one, the book itself was wet. It had been wet, it was warped, and that's what creates that optical effect. I call this one amnesia. It's the idea is kind of that, you know, that in a film, when they kind of create, you know, visually that idea of amnesia, or, you know, things spiraling. I like this one, that it seems like lightning coming across his head. And it's sort of like what he's thinking. What I enjoyed with these is that it's sort of, it felt as though we were catching them in a different way, and they were in the middle of a book or in the middle of thinking, and so it's completely different from the source. And that's why I don't, well, I shouldn't say that actually. This one's titled Jaws, which is related to the book, but it isn't necessary to appreciating the idea of the project. And I like the little bits of snippets of letters. And it's interesting working back and forth between the Dog Ear and the Naked Eye has made me more attentive to all the sort of visual particularities of these subjects. So the texture of the paper and all the sort of incidentals become I'm more conscious of them as I go along. For the most part, I try to find subjects that are not looking into the camera, just because I feel as though that kind of fits the mood I'm working with, which isn't one mood, but I kind of want it to be more that feeling that we're voyeurs. There's something kind of voyeuristic about this project. And another thing I've been thinking about lately, too, is that they're kind of indexical as well, because a lot of them, they're tropes from cinema. They're mostly stills from films. And so the idea is really, in a way, they're not about a particular narrative, but they're about narrative. And they're not about a particular emotion, but they're about emotions. They're sort of, to me, they're kind of indexical in that way. So that ties back to some of my earlier indexical ideas. I like it too, occasionally you get ones where you can read a little bit, but it's not really meant to be fully legible. And then I have a subset series from this project called Nebulous, where I was looking at atmosphere. And finally, I have another project which I'm ending with, not because it chronologically ends, but because you'll see with the very last piece why I chose this to be the final series. But it's also interesting because it kind of brings back some of the things that I'm still looking for and I'm still interested in. So one day I was at a yard sale in Long Island outside of New York City, and I saw player piano rolls for sale. And if you think of a player piano, I tend to think of the music and not words, but this batch happened to have words rubber stamped along. So the way you read this, you read it from the bottom up. So this one says, "I'm tired of looking at the 4 bare walls." And the perforations are holes, and the words are stamped on the paper. So what's interesting for me, in contrast to the dog ear, this project, is that there's texture to that paper too, but I've wanted to make something that was kind of more stark, because every time I've looked at this where I left in all the information that I leave in with the dog ear, the sort of yellowing paper, it kind of just got too noisy, and I made these pieces very large, and so they're almost like on a painting scale, and I wanted it to be just very stark. And they're 20th century lyrics. They're mostly from like the 20s, 30s. In the 40s, during the war, the paper got really, really fragile, and the quality of it was very, very flimsy, because everybody was economical about things. But it was, so I think the 20s, 30s were the best time. And I liked the juxtaposition of these sort of sentimental lyrics with this stark visual field, and also the way in which there's a tension between the different way that you would read it. So and each manufacturer has a slightly different quality, so there's also differentiation between it. For me, that's one of the things that's interesting about the 20th century and industrial technology, is that at the time it felt impersonal. There was all this kind of Charlie Chaplin feeling of these things becoming very impersonal, but there was a lot more texture and quality to it than that we now in hindsight realize. And so even something like this, I'll go back, there's differences within this very industrialized mechanical player piano material. And I just felt that it was very interesting to find and appreciate those different pieces of things, the mechanics of things. I think I'm at the end. Oops. So I thought this was a good end. Thank you.
If we got questions for Erica, can I bring the mic to you so it's captured on film, please? Thank you. There's no questions.
No questions?
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, that was lovely. What was that?
Yeah, it won't make any noise for you, but he will for the film.
Amazing. Could you talk about the encounters maybe with chance or serendipity or spontaneity with undetermined coincidence will seem to happen throughout the work, and how that maybe relates to narrative, because it seems that not only do you find these pieces, they almost present themselves to you, and they're almost begging to be worked with.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that question. I think that, first of all, I would connect it to photography, because the approach when I was doing sort of what you would call sort of deadpan street photography, you're really going out into the world and sort of believing that you're going to have a serendipitous experience, and that within the frame, like the decisive moment in Cartier-Bresson, that something is going to come together in a frame. So I think I carried that into these things and just kind of believe that I'll find things. And what interests me, frankly, is not over-determining what I'll find. So in a way, like with the dog ear, for example, I always kind of have an idea of what I want. I don't really ever find what I want, but I find something else. And then at the same time, I think over time with these different projects, I see certain subjects and certain themes recurring. I'm not sure if I made a selection that would highlight that, but I could make a different selection that would drive that home. So I think there are certain things that resonate for me that will make me pay more attention. But it's more interesting in a way to me to let it be my voice, but it's not my voice. There's kind of a friction between the two.
So I'm best not to shout too much into this. Yeah. I suppose my question is connected a little bit. I was thinking about John Stezaker and the way he talks about the difference between finding and searching, and I wondered whether you could maybe talk a little bit about that and how that connects to your practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I do is I'll kind of give myself constraints. So that's the circumstance that I'll define for myself, and then I search within it. So it's not completely a random thing, but it's kind of a belief that there will be something will be interesting that will happen if I keep going. And I go back to failure because honestly, it's just partly a matter of believing, and it's interesting with the dog year as an example, that when I first started it, I used books on my shelves. And I was lucky that I actually didn't have too much failure, or I would have probably been a little discouraged. Subsequently, going into a larger field of looking for books, the failure rate is higher and higher. And also, the more I carry out a project, the more demanding I am that if I'm either adding something new to it or there's no point. So that also increases the failure rate as well, because it just seems redundant. So again, it's about defining a situation. And for me, the interesting thing is to take something like with dog ear, that it's an action that we do, and find that action and then find something within that action that's different. So that's for me the way I describe it.
Oh, thank you.
Just doing a short jog.
Hi. So aesthetically, even when you're working in digital formats, you've kind of kept an analog feel about your works. I'm just wondering if there's any element of sort of throwback or nostalgia or sort of cultural nostalgia in your work at
Well,
all?
that's something I grapple with, because I feel like there's a couple of different ways I can reply to that. One is to accept the fact that I'm basically a 20th century person, and that I'm thinking about the experience that I had growing up that was a more material world, and that's my source, and that photography for me is about texture as much as anything. So I want things that have a tooth, and I wouldn't say that it doesn't exist in the world around us, but it's just drawing on the things. I never thought that books were going to start to become a thing either. I mean, I really didn't when I started it. But I've also allowed myself to appreciate that aspect of the past. And with the piano player pieces, that was actually distinct from it, because I never experienced to play piano myself. It wasn't something I grew up with. It's distinctly in the past. But it also, for me, has this sort of resonance as a mechanical thing, and this sort of sense of the ghost in the machine, this feeling of a thing that carries on, doesn't need us, which is really relevant right now with AI coming even, in our future. So I think that that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is just to say that with time we can understand the past, and so having a perspective on something and then looking at it like the way an archaeologist might, coming from anthropology, is also important to me. So nostalgia is kind of a dirty word, but I don't.
Yeah.
So.
It's just with art constantly having to take on this kind of reactionary role. So it doesn't really predict anything, it just reacts to things. And some would say that's already too late to be so especially like if you're reacted to, I don't know, like politics or the advance of technology.
Yeah. Well,
Sorry.
All right. Had to be the other side.
Hey, all the projects that you've showed us has been stuff that you've found that you've not like. I've not looked through the books. Like I don't know whether have you ever taken the things that present themselves to you and tried to work them one step further in combination with each other to like get something, so that you've made something rather than just like having. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I have a different project which actually probably would be interesting to include here to answer that, or at least allow that to be understood. It's another project that I did called newspaper clippings, where I take bits of text and then combine them, and it is a collage.
Mm-hmm.
And I've also done, I did a book called Sightings, where it combines a lot of different projects and includes the newspaper clippings and also other pieces. And I've done installations where there were sort of a kind of layered-like installation that combines different parts. So again, that's kind of a collage in the installation. So yeah, I mean, for me, what's challenging about, I'm going to go back to, actually, this is a good one. What's challenging about this is that it's not a collage. And so it's kind of, there's a certain way in which, like, I'll give myself these constraints, and then they're frustrating, but it's that frustration that makes me try to make something in it. So for me, that's the creation, is dealing with that constraint, dealing with that frustration. So.
Thank you.
Thanks. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your photographic influences, because the more that, I mean, when I first looked at your work, I got a sense visually in terms of the aesthetic of it, of a sort of, of conceptual art, and also possibly a bit of appropriation art maybe there. But the more that you've talked about it and your use of the view camera, the more that I'm kind of interestingly seeing some much earlier kind of resonances, so like F64 group or something like that, or some even a kind of that more kind of classical, bringing kind of like sculptural elements to kind of small details and so on, such as with the card index. So just wondering if you could talk to us about that, your...
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's really difficult to trace one source. There's a lot of different things that are inspiring to me. So there's Gary Winogrand and Atget and Versailles and like a whole tradition of photography. But then there's also Ed Ruscha and that sort of thing. And then Sol LeWitt was really inspiring to me just conceptually. So, and then also I studied some Japanese and Japanese language and Japanese poetry, and thinking about looking at language was another influence, and also just loving to read. So there's a lot of different influences. So I mean, I think that also, I mean, I love a lot of work that has nothing to do with what I do. There's a beautiful show at MoMA right now, New York, that is of Russian abstraction from the revolutionary time, and it's just beautiful stuff. And again, I mean, there's bits of things with language and text, really interesting things that they're doing, but also I just respond to abstract art. So yeah, there's a lot of different influences. But I think that in terms of how I work, the constraint idea, which is sort of in sympathy with Oulipo, that kind of thing, is just sort of my affinity. And then the deadpan approach of street photography, and the way in which you could believe that life is going to give you really surprising, surreal experiences. So.
You find something beautiful within something potentially banal or ephemeral.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I was just wondering, Erica, if you actually work outside of the book format in terms of your outputs, because all I've ever seen is these projections tonight, and I love the scale and the imperfections of the paper qualities and the different glitches. So I wonder whether that was something you actually do yourself.
I'm not sure. I'll answer your question. I'm not sure if I understand it, but I mean,
It's whether
how these works.
in the book format.
Oh no! I mean, the works. All of these works exist as artworks.
Yeah.
So they're experienced in exhibitions. as much as in books, or maybe even more in exhibitions, because not every one of these series has made it into a book, although,
Okay, so there may be individual photographic
yeah,
pieces.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. But then what I was describing, there's one way that I work where I combine some of the different projects together, so that's one kind of way of seeing it. But most of the time, they're just distinct images
Okay.
on the wall. And then a number of them have been in books, but the card catalog and the index and the frick have never really been in a book. Excerpts have been in books, but they've never been a book yet. Yeah.
Just a quick question. Have you dog-eared your own book?
Good question. No, I would never do that.
That's all.
It kind of as a follow-on to the previous question, how do you feel your dog ear series reflects on the value that you place on your books? Because the act of creasing the pages destroys the pages to a certain extent, and if you're doing it to so many pages so often, do you feel you're destroying your books?
Well, you know, it's interesting because sometimes I'll reread a book that I haven't read in years and see all those folds, and it's too many folds. It's not the kind of folds you would see from normal use, and it can be irritating. It's true.
Have you lost books to it? Have you lost books to it?
No. I mean, I don't. If I really care about a book, then that's not going to stand in my way. No.
You wouldn't perhaps buy another version of it to give it a try?
No, I mean, sometimes I might have to buy another version of a book if it just got so acidic that it was making me allergic, because unfortunately I'm a little allergic to mold and acidic. So I was feeling really sick a few months ago, and then I realized it was just a book I had that was moldy. Had to get rid of it. But that's the only thing that'll make me have to do that.
Hi. When you design your projects, what's your relationship with colors? They can be a language, so they can help the viewers in interpreting the art.
Well, the colors really have to do with what's found. I mean, it's kind of an after-the-fact appreciation of what's there. So in, let's see. In the case of these, you have basically, it's black and white and yellow and one color. You know, it's kind of limited. This makes me think I should include the newspaper clippings in the next time I present, because that one is where I'm consciously making decisions about color. But the interesting thing about that one was that I initially devised that project for a book where I knew the template for the book was all black and white. So I was not thinking about color. And then afterwards, I looked at the pieces I'd made and realized they were really colorful, and then continued to make the work thinking about the color. But in this case, I would say that it just has to do with again, drawing out something that you almost don't notice and you almost don't think about until you see it in a thing. And then for this last one, it's the absence of color that I thought was necessary. Yeah. Okay.
Hi. I just wondered about, so the fact that everything that you kind of make is about like the details in everyday life that you don't normally notice. I find that things in like our society move quite quickly sometimes. Can you expand a little bit on why maybe you're trying to get people to see things in a different way? I don't know if there's a question in that.
I mean, I think that, again, it goes back to photography. It's a very straightforward approach to going out and believing that somehow you'll find a way to draw your sensibility out of what you see. So it's kind of your subjective experience, and making this external world serve your subjective experience. And so it's, I don't know.
Any final questions, please? Yeah, Patrick.
Just wondering about the process of, if you go back into a couple of the images of the books from the end, so for example the one in red there, say, you find the book and there's a chance element, and then how much is there in terms of your arrangement of this as a sitting model? How much do you manipulate it before you photograph it?
Yeah, well, what I do is I open up the book, and the pages will sort of open up a certain way, and I try to be very, very low tech. It's really, I think it's kind of funny, really, because I think someone with a different personality would have all kinds of different ways in which they would control the book. I want to fight with it a little. I don't really want to always win. I want to let the book fight with me. So I take a pencil maybe, or an eraser, like a really simple thing that might keep a page open. And I kind of want it to be, I don't know. I think, because again, it's like, I think that there's so many variables, and by allowing the book to be part of what, how we arrive at it is important to me.
Yeah. So these are staged
Yeah.
to some extent.
Yeah.
Because they are beautiful images. And if a book opened like that every time I opened it, I'd be really pleased.
Well, I'll open up a book for you and show you.
Okay, well, Erica is staying at Shandy Hall, where there are lots and lots of books. So she's going to have plenty of opportunities to open them up for Patrick. Thank you so much, Erica Baum.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much.